Welcome to our presentation today about understanding ACEs. This presentation was informed by Dr. Melissa Sadin of Ducks and Lions and Tracey Heisler of CASA of Somerset, Hunterdon, and Warren counties. So what does being trauma-informed look like? According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the Federal Government, or SAMHSA, there are 4 parts. Part 1, realize the prevalence of trauma. 2, recognize the impacts. 3, respond in a trauma-informed way. And 4, resist re-traumatizing people. We refer to these as the 4 R's of trauma. When we think of trauma, you might think of something like a car crash, a robbery, a hurricane, or another traumatic event. These are known as single event traumas and can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. What we are talking about today is different. We are talking today about developmental trauma, which is defined as traumatic events like physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse, growing up in poverty or experiencing neglect, harmful cultural or intergenerational practices, separation from parents or caregivers, or exposure to domestic violence that children experienced over a prolonged period of time. This type of repeated exposure to adverse childhood experiences can create developmental trauma, which can result in changes to a child's brain architecture. Let's take a look at the first R, realize the prevalence of trauma. It all started in 1997 with a study by epidemiologist Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti of the CDC. Dr. Folletti had been working on an obesity study for Kaiser Permanente, an insurance company in California, and found a startling correlation between self-reported child abuse and neglect and obesity. Dr. Folletti recruited Dr. Anda to work with him on this adverse childhood experiences study to learn more. The researchers collected background data from 17,000 largely white and well-educated individuals from San Diego, California. Part of the data collected was self-reported experiences during childhood from 3 different categories. The instructions were to answer yes if participants experienced any of the following at least once before age 18. The questions included, have you ever experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse? Have you ever experienced physical or emotional neglect? Did your caregiver experience any mental health issues or substance abuse issues? Did you ever witness domestic violence against your mother, or was one of your parents incarcerated? Were your parents divorced? And an 11th ACE of poverty has since been added. Here's what they found. Roughly 1/3 of respondents, 36%, had 0 ACEs, great childhoods. 27% had 1 ACE, 16% had 2 ACEs, 9% had 3 ACEs, and 12% had 4 or more ACEs. In short, 64% of the 17,000 respondents had 1 or more ACE. A more recent 2018 study with a much larger sample size of 214,157 participants found much the same results, that 1 out of 4 adults had 3 or more ACEs. However, the numbers increase significantly if you're Black, Hispanic, multiracial, part of the LGBTQ+ community, or if you hadn't finished high school, if you were unemployed, unable to work, or came from a very low socioeconomic status. The takeaways for all of us is that more than 1 in 4 American children have experienced trauma. Recognizing the prevalence of ACEs is a crucial part of lowering the ACE score of future generations of children. Since the original study, there's been a growing recognition that other things like systemic racism, substandard housing in schools, and climate change can also be categorized as adverse childhood experiences. The coronavirus pandemic is also considered an ACE. This graphic, which we lovingly call the Wheel of Doom, shows the increase in population-level risks of 3 or more ACEs. The percentages get higher as the ACEs go up. To be clear, not every child who experiences ACEs will see this outcome. However, as a population, there are increased risks for heavy drinking, with a 21.3% increase, cardiovascular disease, 25.5% increase, cancer, 24.3% increase, separation or divorce, 32.9% increase, life dissatisfaction, 67.2% increase, mental health disturbances, 61.4% increase, hopelessness, 42.5% increase, mental health disorders that require medication, 42.7% increase, anxiety, 55.7% increase, and a higher risk of HIV/AIDS of 58.9% increase. Are there any of these that surprise you? One of the things that surprised me is the increased risk in cardiovascular disease and cancer. And one of the things that I learned is that sugar is often the first drug that children find to self-soothe. And this can sometimes lead to emotional-based eating and obesity. We know from the research that stress from ACEs can reduce your ability to respond, learn, and problem solve. It can lower your stress tolerance, leading to fighting, checking out, or acting defiantly. And it can increase the difficulty in making friends and maintaining relationships. We also know that stress from ACEs can increase problems with learning and memory, which can be permanent, increase stress hormones, which affect the body's ability to fight infection, increase the risk of drug and alcohol use and overeating, and can cause lasting health impacts. You may be listening to this and thinking, oh no, I have ACEs. What can I do about that now? You have to know that there is hope. There are lots of things that we can do to reduce the impacts of ACEs. So let's talk about those. For those of you who are visual learners, here's a quick guide to some strategies that the research says are helpful in reducing the impacts of ACEs. Things like slowing down, staying calm, being positive, and taking it easy are good for all of us. So are things like meditation, deep breathing, being outside in nature, having fun and enjoying life, especially with others, and relaxing. Practicing self-care is a vital part of managing the toxic stress of ACEs. Now that we realize that ACEs exist, let's learn about how to recognize their impacts on child development. This graphic is a quote from Ryan North, which I think really encapsulates what we're talking about today. Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. And that's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. Let's learn more about the impacts of ACEs with this video from the Trauma Foundation.
Over half of us have a chronic disorder such as high blood pressure or autoimmune disease. Rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and addiction are skyrocketing. Why? The roots of these issues and more can often be traced to trauma, adverse childhood experiences, chronic stress, and ultimately, nervous system dysregulation. Meet your autonomic nervous system. Let's call it ANS. ANS takes care of a lot of your automatic functions, like your heartbeat, digestion, and body temperature. ANS also manages your survival and stress response, working to keep you alive when your life is in danger. ANS functions as our built-in detection system, constantly scanning our environment for cues of safety and cues of danger. As ANS scans the environment, it has three general responses or states. Safe. You feel calm, relaxed, and connected to those around you. Mobilized. When ANS detects danger, it sends a command and your heart rate and breathing increase. Adrenaline and cortisol are released, and blood rushes to your muscles so you can handle the threat. This is our fight-flight response. Immobilized. When ANS detects that the danger is so great that you can't fight or run, it shuts you down. In this state, our heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature decrease, and pain-numbing endorphins are released. ANS does all of this automatically without us thinking about it. ANS doesn't just use these states for survival. It uses them to navigate through the world each day. When ANS functions well, It moves fluidly from one state to another, 1 minute mobilized and ready for action, and the next resting and recovering. ANDs will often blend states together. When we play, ANDs combines the mobilized and safe states. And when we are intimate with loved ones, it combines immobilized and safe states. When ANDs can stay flexible and fluid like this, it helps us manage and become resilient to stress and negative events. We're able to bounce back and move on. Unfortunately, when we experience trauma and chronic stress, it can keep ANDs from functioning in a healthy, regulated, and resilient way, and can keep us stuck in states of survival. A friendly get-together can become frightening. A simple meeting at work can become threatening. For those with a history of trauma and chronic stress, the ANDs detection system often becomes faulty, constantly signaling danger even when we are safe. It's like ANDs is an alarm system, constantly signaling fire even when there's no smoke and no flames. Consistently living in these survival states can be debilitating, and we often develop adaptive strategies like using drugs, alcohol, food, work, or sex in an attempt to bring regulation and temporary relief. Understanding how trauma impacts us is critically important. There is a whole spectrum of experiences that can be traumatizing and adversely impact ANDs, like accidents, assaults, and natural disasters, which are often called shock traumas. There is also developmental or relational trauma, when we experience chronic adversity, abuse, neglect, and lack of safety while growing up. Many other experiences can be traumatizing, including chronic stress, medical procedures, and adverse community environments like poverty, discrimination, and violence. Additionally, new research in epigenetics shows us that trauma can get passed down genetically at least 3 generations. In the past, we've thought about trauma as events that happen to us. We now know that trauma is an experience, not an event. It's what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. It's our response to the event rather than the event itself. Over 20 years ago, CASA and the CDC launched a groundbreaking study of over 17,000 patients that showed a direct link between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and long-term health and wellness. In the study, 2/3 of participants reported at least one ACE. Over 20% reported 3 or more. When participants reported 4 or more ACEs, this corresponded to an increased chance for heart disease, cancer, drug abuse, and more. With 6 or more ACEs, life expectancy decreases by almost 20 years. We are learning that many physical and emotional symptoms may emerge from a chronically dysregulated ANDs. When ANDs get stuck in survival states, our biology shifts its focus from the tasks that keep us healthy, happy, and thriving to surviving the immediate perceived threat. Many conditions and symptoms that are chronic and difficult to diagnose and treat can be attributed to a dysfunctional ANDs. Our childhood experiences can also keep us from connecting with others. This is vitally important because as children, our number one survival priority is to attach to caregivers. When the people responsible for our safety aren't safe, and we are living in chronic states of unsafety, ANDs doesn't get wired right. The part of ANDs that judges what is safe and what is not becomes faulty. If intimacy and connection were unsafe as a child, as adults, we'll often unconsciously reject attempts from friends and partners to connect. Even though intimacy and connection is what we want, ANDs feels it's unsafe and won't allow it. Trauma compromises our ability to engage with others, replacing the need for connection with the need for protection. When there has been trauma, ANDs can no longer differentiate between our unsafe past and our now safe present. ANDs can't turn off the need to protect, even though we are now safe. So what can we do when ANDs becomes dysregulated? How do we recover from trauma and develop a healthy, regulated, resilient nervous system? Fortunately, we can retrain ANDs to feel safe again. This is best done with the help of others. Each one of us has an ANDs, and our ANDs is constantly communicating with and attuning to the states of others. We autonomically mirror the states of those around us. This is called co-regulating. We see it in herd behavior. If one animal senses danger, the entire group becomes more alert, increasing their chances of survival. We're exactly the same. When we're with others who are stressed, angry, or depressed, it makes us feel worse. When we're with others who are calm and happy, it makes us feel better. Connecting with others who are safe, attuned, and present is the best way to restore a healthy ANS. For those struggling to recover from the impacts of trauma, there is an emerging field of innovative clinical therapies that have been developed to reestablish safety and regulation to ANS. We're also learning that many of the activities we intuitively know make us feel better, like spending time in nature, practicing yoga, dancing, helping others, and more, can help ANS become more regulated and resilient. Healing from trauma and finding release from being stuck living in survival states comes as ANS becomes regulated, increases its capacity for resilience, and regains its flexibility. It's not about being calm all the time or mobilized all the time. It's about having a flexible and resilient nervous system that can accurately assess safety and danger and responds appropriately. We're truly resilient when we can fluidly move from one state to another. For those living with the impacts of trauma and chronic stress, becoming unstuck is like beginning a new life. For the rest of us, understanding how our nervous system states guide our behavior can help us become happier, healthier, and more empathetic human beings. Collectively, we have an epidemic of social issues that are rooted in trauma. If we can do the work to heal past traumas and build healthy, regulated nervous systems as individuals, families, and communities, we can end the cycles that continue to reinforce our greatest challenges and create a safer, vibrant, and more connected world.
This is a really simplified view of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, or the very front of your forehead, is responsible for logic, for reasoning, choice, and understanding consequences. Think critical thinking skills. The hippocampus is in the center and down, and is responsible for emotional regulation, memory formation, language development, executive functioning, and processing speed. The amygdala is the most ancient part of our brain and is also known as the reptilian brain. It has one job and one job only: our survival. It controls our instinctive fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses when we perceive danger. These two MRIs are of 16-year-old males. The one on the left came from a safe and stable home. The youth on the right spent the first 18 months of his life in an Eastern European orphanage. Note the changes in the prefrontal cortex on top, the hippocampus in the center, and the amygdala on the bottom. What differences do you see? If you take nothing else from this training, understand that developmental trauma changes the brain architecture of the children who experience it. The behavior challenges that come from this exposure to ACEs is due to the brain's attempts to keep them safe, not from a conscious choice to be difficult or defiant. Another consideration is the fact that the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. Children cannot do more than their brains are ready for. ACEs can delay or stunt brain development. It's no surprise that some children struggle in school, have challenging relationships, and sometimes exhibit difficult behaviors. Their brain development could have been compromised by exposure to ACEs. The good news, however, is that brains can be rewired. There is hope and there is help available. Let's take a moment to review some of the ways the amygdala responds to keep us safe when we perceive a threat. When the brain thinks that the fight response is most appropriate, you might see a kid who is oppositional, argumentative, stubborn, challenging authority, or dangerous or violent. Some of what you might see in kids with the flight response include being distracted or hyperactive, attention seeking, might flee or hide, and exhibit avoidance behaviors. When you see the freeze response is triggered, you might see a child who seems lazy or inattentive, doesn't try, doesn't seem to care, stares off into space, and daydreams. All of these listed mental health issues are real, but sometimes they are misdiagnosed. Sometimes it's developmental trauma. And it's vitally important to remember that once the amygdala has been activated, children and youth have no control over their brain's response to a perceived threat. It's not that they won't stop the behavior. They can't stop the behavior. It takes the brain and the body about 20 minutes for stress hormones to cycle and de-escalate. They need time to reset. You might also see physical signs of toxic stress, like nausea, headaches, trembling, or a general feeling of malaise. These are the children who are often frequent flyers to the school nurse's office. Emotionally, you might see things like flashbacks or memory gaps, fear or anger. These responses can be misinterpreted as not cooperating, being adversarial, or acting aggressively. The reality is that these are children who are deeply afraid and they're trying to figure out how to stay safe. So let's take a moment to talk about what trauma looks like in children. Traumatized children may be hypervigilant or in a constant state of arousal, which can be seen as hostile or aggressive. If you think about the difficulty of running dual processes like staying safe and writing a paragraph or doing math equations, you can begin to see how challenging school can be for some children. Many studies have found that children who've experienced abuse often develop the ability to recognize facial expressions and emotional states in others with a high degree of accuracy. Also be aware of children who are disengaged or tuned out. They may deal with their trauma by suppressing their emotions. Just because they're quiet and not disruptive, it doesn't mean that everything is okay. We also know that trauma can affect teens' brain development and impair the creation of coping strategies and trusting relationships. These difficulties may impede any efforts by authority figures to effectively relate to them and gain their trust. The best way to address this is to keep showing up, remain consistent, and provide them with unconditional regard. It goes a long way to building a trusting and engaged relationship with teens. We now realize that ACEs are real, and we have a foundational understanding of how to recognize them. So now let's talk about how to respond in a trauma-informed way. So what should you do when you see something that looks like an ACEs response? You want to wait at least 15 to 20 minutes before you try to engage. Address safety and security concerns, and when they're ready, allow the child to vent, to talk about what happened. Validate their feelings, and ask the question, what happened, instead of, what's wrong with you, or what did you do? Explain what happens next, and if you don't know what happens next, find out beforehand to help them prepare. There are several research-based strategies that have been shown to de-escalate the amygdala. In fact, some studies have shown that pairing meditation and yoga are as effective in symptom reduction as counseling and medication. Other strategies include things like exercise, doing yoga, running, stretching, sports, getting good sleep, good nutrition, breathing exercises of deep breathing, of in and out, coloring puzzles, art, addressing mental health needs. Some of the gold star interventions include things like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or EMDR. There's also some anecdotal reports that EFT, or emotional freedom tapping, is very helpful in reducing symptoms. You want to maintain a regular schedule and create an environment of trust. It's especially important that you keep your word. Watch what you say and watch how you say it. Communicate effectively and transparently. Be honest and help where you can. And you want to encourage healthy relationships with caring, engaged adults. That's the number one predictor of children getting through these adverse childhood experiences. There was a study in 2018 that focused on the genetic basis for resilience. And while resilience can be taught, it can be more challenging for some children than others. Specifically, dandelion children can thrive in all different kinds of environments and circumstances. They tend to be hardy and resilient. Orchid children need specific environments to live. They're more fragile than the dandelions, but with appropriate support, consistency, and encouragement, they too can thrive. For more information about orchids and dandelions, check out The Orchid and the Dandelion: Why Some Children Struggle and How All Can Thrive by Dr. W. Thomas Boyce. As I mentioned, there's evidence to suggest that resilience is genetic as well as learned. There's a growing body of research around epigenetics, which is the study of how factors may be passed through generations to help us survive. Specifically, if our parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents experienced adversity, those experiences are encoded in our DNA to help us adapt and survive similar challenges in our day. Isn't it a beautiful thought that our ancestors reached forward in time to help us survive and thrive? Florida State University developed this model of the components of resilience. They include a sense of belonging, sense of control, coping strategies, connection with caring, safe adults, character, and flexibility. Focusing on these component parts can help repair the damages done by ACEs. As adults, how can we build resilience in children? Well, first we can model resilience. We can also learn and understand typical child development and effective parenting skills. We can build attachment and nurture relationships. And if you need help with any of these strategies, Nurtured Heart Training is widely available to help build connections with intense or challenging children. We can build social connections with others, make sure that children's basic needs are met, build their social and emotional skills, and provide opportunities for them to succeed. Remember, when kids with ACEs act out, it's because they feel unsafe. We can de-escalate this feeling by providing them with a sense of belonging through community engagement. Invest in building caring and engaged relationships with them. Be careful with your words. Remember to respond rather than react. It can be very easy to damage the trust that we've built with a careless word, criticism, or a sharp tone. It's important to remember that we are people too, with needs, fears, worries, and stress. Take care of yourself. It is the key to being the best parent and caregiver that you can be. And if you aren't sure what this might look like for you, here are some strategies that you can try. At the end of the day, have empathy when kids are struggling. Think about how hard it must be to have all of those emotions pushing up and outward while their brain is screaming that they're not safe. It must feel like playing chess in a hurricane. So now we've reached the 4R, resist re-traumatization. There are some common triggers to re-traumatization, which include things like feeling a lack of control, experiencing unexpected change, feeling threatened or attacked, feeling vulnerable or frightened, and feeling shame. Here are some strategies that you can utilize to avoid re-traumatizing kids. Provide controlled choices after the child becomes more regulated. Consider what might increase a child's sense of safety if separation from others is necessary. You want to use restorative practices instead of punitive ones, of keeping kids feeling fully engaged and accepted instead of punished. Prepare the child for consequences in advance and work with them to create a plan when they're not upset. Focus on their strengths, talk about the behavior, not the child, and moderate your own tone and volume when you're responding. To recap, the 4 R's of trauma are realize ACEs exist and understand victims' responses to stress and fear. Learn the signs so you can recognize it when you see it. Respond in a trauma-informed way that can help children build resilience and form connections with trusted adults. And be aware of your own actions to resist re-traumatization. Here's the best thing you can do as a parent to build an environment where your child feels safe, valued, respected, and heard. Be that safe space for them. Thank you.